and welcome everyone to Project Kin's final episode of this remarkable Forget Me Not series featuring Jane Hutcheon in the deep and thoughtful discussions about how we memorialize. Memorializing is that very special form of storytelling about ourselves and our loved ones that we have been looking at in all sorts of different forms. Today, we have a very special guest to be closing out the program. And for her introduction, let me turn to Jane Hutcheon. Go ahead, please, Jane.
Thanks so much, Bob, and a warm welcome to everyone from wherever you are. This is a really special session number 5 because, as those of you who followed the whole series knows, we have started with pop-up memorials. We have spoken with Peter Billingham on the art of eulogy. We spoke to Rhonda Lauritsen on creative ways to write family stories. And last month, we had James Haggerty, Bob, as we called him, who is an obituary writer for the Wall Street Journal. And I thought it would be perfect to round out the series today with somebody who writes about family history, but in a very different way. It's kind of like, I call it an intersection between memoir and family history. And for many of our community, Ailsa is from Australia. So I thought I'd read out her bio in case you're not aware of her wonderful work and heard about her books. But Ailsa is an expert in the art of reinvention. It's something she's done professionally all her life, whether that's as an actor, a director, an audiobook narrator, or a writer. After her husband Peter died suddenly, Ailsa began the task of mastering the art of moving forward, and she did it with the assistance of seahorses, ravens, an Amazon swimming coach, and a grumpy octopus. She's also a wonderfully warm speaker, as we're about to hear, and she has created many memorials for her friends and loved ones. So the book she published last year is called For Life, and it's a moving insight into loss, hope, and starting again. But she's also written 2 other memoirs, which are equally beautiful, Sitting Across Spain and The Attachment. So Ailsa, welcome to the Project Kin family.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Barb, too, for having me.
Ailsa, I wonder, I like to start by asking our guests to this series about how their own subject and area relates to family history. So in your own mind, how does the issue of memorializing or memorials relate to family history?
Well, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? It's contested when you decide to tell the story of family members, because everybody in a family has their own story. But of course, there are facts that no one can dispute, birthdays and things like that. But I suppose the main thing for me is that there had already been 2 books written about. So this book, my book, tells the story of the death of my husband and the death of my father, 2 good, kind men. But my father had written his own story for us, which is a memorial that, you've talked about, and I'm sure many of your community members have done. And it was a wonderful thing to have that. And my mother, before she died, had also written her story, and they intersected reasonably well. But my parents divorced when I was very young, and so they didn't conflict, but there were gaps. But it was a wonderful thing. I suppose the thing I would say to anybody about memorializing is to think about memorializing yourself if you have children. I don't have children, so I've always wanted to kind of honor others who came before me. But I think as a child of 2 parents who wrote 2 fantastic, recollections, and really my mother detailed back several generations, it was the most wonderful gift. And I'm amazed that my darling father, at the age of 85, mastered a computer, so that he could write it. he felt his handwriting was not good. So yeah, I don't know if that completely answers the question of what it has to do with that, but I would say memorialize oneself as much as others it's a really important thing.
I wonder what in the family histories that your parents wrote maybe surprised you, or was something that just came out of the blue?
Well, I think it was the voice because, I mean, I'm 66. It's not like I'm a kid. And my father died 2 years ago. I was very young when my mother died. And I think Mum wrote hers. So I was in my early 30s. Mum wrote it probably when I was in my late 20s. I think Mum wrote hers with an eye to her children. So it was a voice that was quite familiar to me. We were still little. She knew she was dying and wanted to leave her story. So it was kind of, she speaks to us, as though we're her children. But my father's voice, he wrote it when he was in his 80s, and we were all we were all practically geriatrics ourselves. And it was the thing of being spoken to as a comrade in a way, as an equal, this sort of comrade in old age in a way. And that was a very beautiful thing because in the day-to-day of stuff, Dad called me Bubby until until a month before he died, when I finally said, please stop. But he didn't write to me as Bubby. He wrote to me as an equal. And I think that was a very lovely surprise. He didn't write just to me, by the way. He wrote to all his children. The book was for all of us. But yeah, I think the voice, and that's an interesting thing that as a creative writer, I suppose I would say to anyone who's wanting to memorialize someone by writing their story or their own, is to think in a way about who you're writing it to. I mean, are you writing it for little people who are going to get it when they grow up? Are you writing it for people who don't know you, people who know you intimately? That voice, that confessional, confidential, confiding, unpacking voice, it can take many forms, and it's a good thing to experiment with it, I suppose.
Ailsa, a lot of people struggle with voice because, I mean, speaking from a family history perspective, we want to include pretty much the whole gamut of someone's life, which is never possible, really. But we try because we think each element of that chronology, I suppose, of a life is important. And I wonder, in reading your parents' own, I guess they were little mini memoirs in a sense, were there a lot of areas where you had different memories or different memories of the same incident, and also between your siblings?
I didn't use my parents' histories very much when I was writing mine, because it's not a life memoir really, although of course I tell their backstories. But memory is such an interesting and slightly contested and fraught area with memoir always. I mean, I spoke to someone the other day, I was interviewing them about their most recent memoir, and I asked about one of the characters, and he said, oh, he's sort of made up, he's kind of a composite, he's kind of a bit of everything. And I went, oh, I had totally bought it. And it was like, but this is memoir. Memoir has to be true. So of course that word is it contains many things. But for me, oh my goodness, there's one incident in the book that I'm very upfront as much as I can be about what I do and don't remember well. I think that's important to say. This is my memory, But there's one incident in the book. So at one point, my family had rocky financial stories, and at one point there was a bailiff coming. And my mother, I don't know how my mother got wind of this, but she found out that the bailiff was coming to take the television. Hard to imagine now because everyone's got televisions, but back then it was a useful, kind of valuable thing. And so she put it into the bathroom, and she put the 3 children into the bathroom. But I remember it. I don't remember this incident at all. I don't believe it happened. My brother says that I was told to stand in the shower with the water on so that she could say, you can't go in there, my daughter's in the shower, and that the other 2 were there. And my little sister says that it was her in the shower and that I was nowhere to be seen. And so I've just had to kind of put all of that into the book and say, well, somewhere there was an incident where somebody came to the door wanting a television. but it's a wonderful thing to have. I mean, I have, living siblings, which is aside from being a great gift for me, it's also a very useful resource because they can say to you, you're getting sentimental. They can say to you, you've gone off piste, or they can say to you, that's just rubbish. You've made it up. But I do think memory, where possible, not to rely on memory, I think is important. And when you do rely on memory, it's the thing of one. I think it's useful to know why a memory might matter to you. I mean, I think that's a lovely thing for some people, anyway, at least to incorporate into it. It's not just that there is a memory, it's that why that memory? Because we've all got stuff floating around there, but the ones that surface and the ones that somehow take on importance and stay with us, there must be something about them that's key. And to sort of know what that is, I think, is a really useful and lovely thing, potentially.
Tell us about your beloved Peter, because he's a key part of the book, obviously, but he's also a key part, but a changing part of you.
Yes. I'm sure many people here would have had that experience of someone dying, and you feel like what you hadn't understood. I mean, I had a lot of experience with death. I have been sort of farewelling and burying and people since I was about 16. My best friend died, but a partner, a husband of 28 years, it's the domestic thing, I think, that no one had actually prepared me for, that when you are literally with someone, and we were two actors, or an actor and a writer, we were literally in the house together all the time. I hadn't really been prepared for that particular absence. Everywhere I looked, the house was only absence. It wasn't presence anymore. Peter was an actor. He was. We met backstage when he came backstage to see me in a play, but we actually worked together a couple of weeks after that in a radio play. Can you imagine such a thing these days? They don't really exist. But we were playing Star-Crossed Lovers, and I remember we were recording something, we'd rehearsed it, and he went out. We were supposed to be strolling through a garden. At lunchtime, he went out and bought fresh freesias and scattered them around the microphone so that we'd have the feeling of the garden. And I thought, oh, I'm done. That's it. I'm gone. So he was great. I mean, he was an extraordinary, beautiful actor. He was a lovely, deeply decent human being. And he died suddenly, unexpectedly. He was perfectly well, but he had a brain aneurysm, and I was not there. I was interstate doing a book gig. And so it took me a long time to understand that he was gone. But more than that, I don't know that this is past tense, but it took me a long time, and perhaps is still taking me a long time, to kind of figure out who I am without him and as a result of him, because I am not the person I was before him. I am not the person I was when I was with him. I'm much grumpier. He really sort of softened edges. I realized that one of the things we do with siblings, with family, with parents too, I suppose, is we create different relationships with everyone, but we are different selves with everyone. So in a way, the act of memorializing, I can only memorialize the person I knew. I can't memorialize the person that Pete's sister knew, really. There are certain things I can say that are common, but it's an interesting thing, that, and you have to sort of start again. And I'm much more pernickety than I was when Pete was alive. Everything has to be in its place, and I don't tolerate mess very well. Oh God, we won't go into my psychology.
Well, I've only known you after Peter's death, and I didn't notice you in any of those descriptions that you gave. So I think you're being hard on yourself. But this element of farewelling people, as you said, you have done since you were 16. And I've had the gift of going to a funeral that I know you organised, and it was an incredibly amazing balance of soulfulness, artfulness, and with a light touch of religion. And I wonder, how did you gain this knowledge of how to put together a farewell for someone? Is it literally from life experience?
I think it's a few things. My second book was a collection of letters between me and a very old Catholic priest, and it was a sort of a story of a friendship across a divide. So I've had Catholic education, but I'm not traditionally religious. But I do think there's the thing we have in common is that religion has ritual, and the world that I matured in, the theatre, is ritual. And so I remember saying to Tony at one point, the priest, showbiz people give really good funerals. And it wasn't flippant. It's because we understand spatial relationships. We understand the value of the word, the written word, the spoken word, the sung word. We know how that stuff works on the body. We know about pauses. We know a lot about the way a ritual works because that's theatre. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way to anybody, but I think if you look at all the rituals we have in any culture, they have an element of theatricality about them. People put on clothes. It's like there was a friend of mine who, like me, loves scarves, and everyone had to wear a bright scarf to her funeral. Now, that was a tribute to her, but it's also a kind of theatrical thing to say, we're not all going to be in black and we're going to do something flamboyant to remember this person. And so there's a kind of a theatrical thing about it. I think also with Peter's funeral, which I organised in the most pedantic way, probably, but I very much was incorporating theatre into that because it was a theatrical, was a person of the theatre and all that. So a theatre designer friend of mine painted the most beautiful on blue velvet sort of shroud to cover the coffin, and it was painted with stars and the moon because every night Pete would go out and look at the moon and the stars before he came to bed. And that draped over the coffin because I didn't want to look at a coffin. I didn't want to see Peter in a coffin. So we found ways of making beauty where my eyes didn't see it. And the other thing I guess I would say, if I can talk for 1 second more, is the funeral booklet. Everybody has the funeral booklet, which is just usually a template. And I understand that for many people, that's a security, the template. It wasn't for me. I'm a writer. For me, it was a chance to really write a mini book about Peter and his friends. And so I wrote a welcome, which was a whole page telling the story of Peter looking at the stars and why there was the thing. And then for every person who spoke, I wrote about their relationship with Peter and wrote sort of very lovingly, I think, about what those friendships had meant, because Pete had a lot of female friends, and I knew that some people might have thought that was interesting. I wrote about his family. I wrote about the relationships so that no one who stood up was unfamiliar to the hundreds of people there. And I feel like that book was a chance to tell Peter's life to people who only knew fragments of it. So I think that's why artists I have one friend who decorated her own coffin in the weeks before she died. She painted it, and it was an act of artistry, but it was also an act of coming towards what was ahead. But it was also a memorializing, because she was saying, look at what I've made, look at what I am. So yeah.
I know in your situation you had a few days to prepare for the funeral because there wasn't an inquest, was it?
No, but his body had to be taken to the coroner because he died alone at home here in Australia anyway. I don't know if it's the case in other countries. Even if someone just dies alone at home of natural causes, they have to go to the coroner. And so we had quite a long wait for the funeral. So yes, I did have a bit more time than probably mostly people have, and probably a bit more time than is good. But I do think that time in between the death and the funeral is a wonderfully sort of important and productive time, however long it is, because it gives you a point to your days. And suddenly when your days are pointless after that, it's a bit of a shock. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think many of us who are suddenly faced with death, the funeral is something that we have to get ready for, usually quite quickly, because there are people coming to visit, and then it's over. And I wonder if you were You know, I noticed in Geraldine Brooks's book, Memorial Days, which was published earlier this year, she spoke, she's converted to Judaism, and she spoke about how the Jewish rituals in terms of timings, you know, what you should be doing during each period of mourning were extremely useful. And I was wondering whether you've done much investigation into, you know, borrowing different cultures and things like that to move through processes and to create memorials.
Yeah, interesting you say that, because one of my dear friends who's Jewish gave me a book, and it did have those timeframes in it. And I found it wonderfully useful up until the point where it said that in the Jewish culture, they mourn for a parent for a year, but for a child or a partner, the sort of set mourning times doesn't mean that people stop feeling grief, of course, or anything, but the set time is 3 months. And I asked her about that, or I think it was in the book, and it's because you can actually replace those people. You can't replace a parent, but you can replace a child. And this is a culture and a people who've had to think about practically, we have to have survival in a way that lots of cultures haven't had to think about. But it didn't work for me after that. It was like, I'm sorry, Peter's worth more than 3 months. So I got a bit gnarly about that. But I tell you what did help. I mean, lots of things helped, actually. There was a beautiful ritual that Tony, the priest, kind of did with me after the funeral. He came to our house, and I would really recommend this, not as a formal thing, but it was deeply, deeply helpful for me after the funeral when I felt stranded. He sat down and he said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "I think I'd like to pray." So we said the Our Father, and I said, "Why did I want to say the Our Father?" And he said, "It's a prayer that you said in childhood because that's when everything was safe and everything was okay. So you want those forms and shapes that came from then, even if you are not subscribing to them now." But then he did this beautiful thing where he said, "Let's start in the front room. Take me through the front room and tell me the story of the objects, the room in terms of you and Peter." And honestly, I do it now, not just for deaths, but for all manner of things when someone's in distress, because their domestic space holds all their stories. And so literally it was like that lampshade. Oh, we bought that secondhand at a garage sale, when we were first starting out. And it just let me unpack the story in a very different way. And I've never forgotten that, because he gave me about 3 hours. It was incredible because I just wanted to talk about Peter. And in a way, that was a kind of it was a one-on-one memorializing, but I didn't understand that what he was doing was just saying, just tell me the story. And I mean, it's the deepest wish in all of us. It's the most primal thing. We have a story, and the people we love have a story, and we want the story to go on, and it gets cut short. And so to be allowed to tell it is a really profound thing, I think, however you find that. So yeah, that was a great little ritual to have. But the other one, which came from a culture, was from a Buddhist friend who explained to me that in that culture, they think that it's possible that someone can actually stay around until they reincarnate for up to 49 days. But by 49 days, they go to their next place or, stage. And for some reason, that worked for me. And so for 49 days, I sat each night and just said a little prayer that they'd given me, which was a beautiful prayer. And as part of it, it said, "Peter has taken the great leap." And I loved that wording because it felt like something up and joyous as opposed to being snatched away, which was how I felt about him. And I said it for 49 days. And on the 49th day, the morning after the 49th, I came down. It was midwinter in Melbourne, which for people who don't live in Australia, it's freezing in midwinter in Melbourne. It's a particularly cold winter. And I came down and the back doors were thrown wide open. And I mean, I was frightened. I was locking doors. I was closing things down at that point. I know I had locked and double bolted doors. And honestly, I came down in the morning and just stood looking at these wide open doors. I'm not someone who, subscribes easily to I like the idea of coincidences and stuff, but that did feel like it meant something. But doing the practice for 49 days was actually a rather beautiful thing, just lighting a candle, saying that little prayer.
Ailsa, what is your take on grief? Because in a lot of writing, there is this sense that grief can be something that you get over, and it's about going through a number of processes until you get over it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on grief.
Well, my best thought is not mine. It's something I only was told about 6 months or so ago. I probably would have stolen it for the book if I'd got it earlier. But someone said to me, grief is like this stone that you put into your pocket, and it's never going to leave your pocket. But there comes a moment when you actually don't notice it in your pocket. And it's not that the stone has got smaller, it's that you've got stronger. You've got sort of more ability to carry it. And I rather liked that, because I do think, and in a way you don't want it to go away. I mean, here's an interesting thing, and I don't think he would mind me telling it. My brother's wife died very suddenly in the same manner as Peter. I mean, you really would not marry into my family. My husband, my sister-in-law, and my stepmother all died in sort of suddenly, unexpectedly, of aneurysms and such things. But it's been 15 years today since his wife died. And just recently, he has started a new relationship. And one of the things that's interesting to me about it is that it's with someone he knew a long time ago, whose husband died not, a few years back. And he said, what's really nice is that part of our relationship is we talk about our partners because we knew them both. And he said, so I don't have to pretend that there isn't still grief. I can, it's like you can love. I mean, I don't know if that's a word they've used to each other. I haven't asked. I think it might be, but I'm now talking about me. But you can love and still have the grief sit somewhere, because it is part of you. It changes you irrevocably, doesn't it? I mean, and if it didn't change you, I suspect you'd be probably not aware of the change. That's the thing. You would be changed, but you wouldn't be aware of it. But I think it's a maturation. I mean, I think someone said to me after Peter died that he didn't know what to say to me, because he had never lost anyone. And this was a man at the time in his 60s. And I just said to him, get down on your knees and give thanks for the first thing. But also I thought, if you haven't lost, you haven't been asked to mature in that particular way. And I'm not saying it's a great thing, but I think that if you consciously are aware that, there's been this rupture, you have to grow. You can't, I mean, I don't think you have any choice but to grow. So I think grief, it's interesting, they both start with GR. I think grief is a kind of growth, but maybe it's like roses have to be pruned in winter so that they can have their big flowering the next season. I don't know, but I don't think there's any escaping it. I really don't.
Because you've said to me in the past that life is about learning how to live with death. And I pondered on that for many hours afterwards, because it's true. We have it around us all the time, and it's not about trying to shut doors. It's trying to leave the doors open, even if there's a little breeze coming through and you might not want it at that time. It's really about encompassing everything around us, isn't it?
And it's an interesting thing. I mean, the actor in me sort of rears up now, where I go, yes, it is about learning to live with death, but it's learning to live with death. It's where you place the emphasis, because some people,
true.
Some people think, oh, well, I live with death, and that, that's just like, great, good, you're living with death, but I'm living with death. And I think the living is the thing that somehow we have to get back to. And I remember the moment when I first heard myself laugh and didn't feel guilty, because Pete couldn't laugh. And for a long time, I remember actually saying to a friend who'd photographed me laughing, and it was only a month or so after Pete died, and saying, delete that photograph. I mean, it was so silly, but I didn't want evidence that I was happy even for a moment. It felt traitorous. And now I think it's not just that thing, because I don't think any of us knows what the person would want. It's not just that thing of Pete would want you to be happy. I mean, yes, I hope he would, but it's more the thing of what is life for if it's not for expansion and for being present to it. I don't ever want to shut myself off from it. And on the occasions when I have, it's just felt like such disrespect to this heart that keeps beating, There's a fabulous thing, a bit off the track, but Tony does this exercise. Everybody can do it. You just, you take your hand and you just do that and just keep doing it and doing it. And after a little while, your hand will get really sore. Mine's starting to get tired. And then he says, that's what your heart's doing 24/7. And when he first did that for me, I thought, wow, if that little muscle's working that hard, I'm going to pay respect to it and be in the world a bit more. It's like the heart's beating. It's not stopping. So, yeah, until it does, I'd like to live. Yeah, yeah.
How should we, in your suggestion earlier on, to memorialize ourselves? How, for example, we've got a blank page in front of us. How would we go about that? And how can family history help us?
Well, I think the greatest thing you can do, actually, the best conversation opener in the world, is to start with a grandparent. I don't know anyone, when you say to them, have you got grandparents? Did you have grandparents? Of course, everyone does. And they'll almost immediately go, oh, my Lord, I had this grandmother or grandfather. It's, for some reason, it's easier than to talk about the parents to start with. The grandparents are always vivid and kind of like, I have this memory of my grandfather, and he used to take me around the garden, and he had a duck, and the duck would eat the snails. And it was like, and do you know what I think it was? I think it was that he paid deep attention to me. I mean, Mary Oliver, the great Mary Oliver, the great American
poet.
Yes. She says attention is the beginning of devotion. And I think grandparents sometimes, not always, but mostly, I think, have time to give attention to children. And that means that we remember them in a particular way. So I would say, if you don't know where to start and you're looking, just start with writing a memory of a grandparent, the funniest, dearest grandparent, or the silliest, most eccentric grandparent, and see where it takes you, see how it unlocks you. Because in my experience of writing workshops and things, getting people to write stuff, always a grandparent somehow opens things, whereas a parent there can be a conflicted relationship with a parent. It's more of a sort of a tussle often. So that, I would say. And the other thing is, I would say, I mean, if you've got the facts, you can imagine into them too. I mean, it doesn't have to be, like, a memoir doesn't have to be absolute fact. So let's say that someone was born and they were christened in this funny old, church out in the country that's now crumbling down. You can start by saying, I imagine my grandmother in her christening robes, and the tree then must have been such and such. And you can make it up, because the minute you say, I imagine, it's all right. What you're talking about is your relationship to that person. I mean, it sort of depends. Obviously, some people will have more than others, but I think filling in the gaps, so long as you're clear that they're imagined, it still tells us something about the person you're imagining, because the nature of what you describe will be about the relationship you have. Does that make sense?
That's lovely. What about if you choose to write about something and somebody close to you disagrees with what you've written? So either they remember it differently, or they say somebody said a completely different thing. How have you managed to live with that, or do you always take, if they're not happy with it, that's something that's just immediately removed?
I think there's two things. I would never include something if someone said to me, I can't abide that. That's hurtful or painful to me. I don't want that. That hasn't happened. but people have certainly remembered things differently. And I love that. That goes straight in. In fact, in the book, there's one little email from my brother about that incident I related earlier. And I actually love it because you get this injection of a different voice. He speaks and writes very differently to me. He's much more direct and straight to the point. And suddenly to have this injection of this other voice, it sort of wakes the reader up. It certainly wakes me up. And I think also those differences are the human thing. I mean, there is no true story. There is no complete beginning to end true story. There is always, another shade, another, it's like that thing of live with death. I hear live with death. Someone else hears live with death. Someone else, it's like, and those are nuances that we have within our relationships with people. It's not just about what we heard, but it's what we lived. In fact, there's a wonderful example of this. The book I wrote about the walk across Spain. At one point, I walked with these two old Italians. Gosh, they were fabulous. They were both in their late 60s, sort of, I'm nearly there now. And they would do 30 kilometres a day without thinking, and they were joyous and everything, but they would snap photos. We didn't have iPhones at that point. We both had little cameras, or all three of us did. And at the end of one particular rainy day, we had walked together for 30 kilometres side by side. And at the end of that day, we sat down and we looked, as you used to be able to, to kind of flick back through the viewfinder, and we were looking at our photos. There was barely a single photo that was the same in all three cameras, because what we had seen and what had been important to us had been entirely different based on who we were. So we'd walked exactly the same road at the same time. But if I had written the story of my walk, it would have been totally different to the story of the Capitano. It was just fascinating.
I love that idea. I love that idea because it suggests that literally everything we do is original in its own way. And we shouldn't be cowed, or we shouldn't be worried that we're going to step on someone else's toes. We should just tell our stories.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is just, it sounds so naff, but kindness. I mean, if you're going to tell a story, it's kindness to yourself as the teller, but kindness to the people. I don't mean you have to whitewash. God forbid, I don't think that's. But I do remember one thing. I was mentoring someone who was writing a memoir, and I said to her, you cannot assume you know what someone else felt. She had a lot of things in it where she said, Mum felt this, Mum felt that. And I said, unless you've got a quote from her that says, I felt, you can say, it seemed to me that Mum felt, but you cannot actually claim to know the feelings of another person. Because I slept beside Peter 28 years, of my life, I slept beside him, but I still wouldn't claim to know exactly what he felt at any given moment, because we are mysteries to each other right to the end. And I think that's one rule I would say about the memoir thing is, you can claim to think you have a sense of, but you can't say Jane felt blah, blah. That's not fair. That's not fair.
Fair enough too. Well, I thought I might try and open the floor to some questions. I can take questions either live, and you can open your cameras and your mics and come on and say hello, or you're very welcome to also put them in the chat and I will read them out. I think last time I got told to make my questions a bit shorter, so I will attempt to do that. Ailsa, I'm interested in, we did talk a little bit about funerals, but who is a funeral for in your mind?
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because, of course, I think there are some people who plan their funerals down to the nth degree beforehand, and I've got several friends who've done or are doing that. And I understand that because I'm quite controlling. But I do think ultimately they're part of a process towards healing. And so they are for the people left behind. Of course, part of that is that it's lovely to, what we want to hear is the person's story, the person who's died. We want their story. That helps us heal. And it's comforting to think of the things that they loved. It's comforting to honour what they've suffered. It's comforting to be with the other people they loved. But I do feel that funerals, in fact, I was thinking about my friend whose child died in Bali, and one of the things they do, aside from burning the body and everything, is what's left, the little bones, they put into a bowl, and she had to crush them. And to us that might seem terrible, but for her there was a thing of, this teaches me that she really is gone when I can't get it into my mind. So I think whatever you subscribe to about your cultural beliefs, they are as much, if not more, I think, for the people left behind. Yeah. But that's contested, I know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a lovely thought, and it's correct. But you always want to do what you promise people that you would do when they're gone too. So I guess there's always that sort of slight balance there. I did. Bob's asked a question, but I also wanted to get in. You mentioned about, and we also spoke before about the order of service and what you can do with an order of service when you're preparing a funeral, because many of us receive literally a booklet with a picture on the front, some prayers, hymns, when they should stand up and sit down, and the minutest amount of biographical detail. And I'm always super hungry for more, even in those online obituaries. I feel like they barely scratch the surface. What would be your tip in terms of a booklet or a card when someone goes? And I mean, is the funeral the right time, or is it better to come out with something like that a little later?
Well, I certainly did use the booklet, as I said, at the funeral, and it was quite a thick thing. I mean, that was an expense that I wanted people to know Peter's story in a way. And I wanted people to know the other people in his story, not just me. We'd been this, because we didn't have children, we were the two of us, but I wanted them to know why Helen was the one who was reading Yeats and why Yeats. And so I told the story of how Peter had memorized all these Yeats poems so that when we went to places in Ireland together, he would just sit beside me and say a poem, because he wanted to be able to do that. And so I wanted them to know why Yeats, but I also wanted them to know why Helen, who was reading it. And Helen was an actress who Peter had loved working with, and they'd developed a friendship, but she was a person he admired. And so I was able to talk a bit about Helen and that relationship. And I think people get nervous about doing the right thing because there is this template. But I just said to the funeral director, I'll be needing extra pages. And, that's where you've got first reading, I'll be putting this, and then I'll be saying it's read by blah, blah, and their relation, and I wrote, it was a sort of a love letter in a way to Peter and to his other people, but quite a lengthy one. But then also, I should just say, when I scattered his ashes, which was months and months later, we had a ceremony out in the country where we were scattering them. And at that time, because I was a little more integrated, I wasn't in the first shock, we just told stories. And it was a smaller group. There were hundreds at his funeral, but this was maybe 30 people who really were close in. And we told stories, and we put a time capsule into the ground. And there were letters and things. And that was a very lovely thing to do. And I know I can go back and dig that up if I ever want to, but it was kind of like a really lovely memorial, the time capsule. Because we'd had time to think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. There are some other questions on the chat. Bob has asked, what do you think we've learned about funerals since the pandemic period?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure. I do think the video online thing is a great thing, actually. I mean, I've been to funerals, all around the world, and that I would never have been able to go to thanks to the streaming. I think there's a lot more to be had from the streaming service. Of course, the theatrical sort of part of me thinks that we could use that in more creative ways. But I think it's grown fantastically. I think that, I don't know if it's the pandemic, but I am interested that we are starting to think too about actually what is best for the planet in terms of how we deal with bodies. And remains and all of that, because actually, as we know, most of these things cost the planet a lot. And, you know, if I had my druthers, I would love to be just dug under a tree, you know, and left there to do my bit for the tree. I love the idea that every tree would just have a little initial carved into it somewhere, and, you know, that was Ailsa growing. But that's not for everybody, I know. But yeah, I think the main thing for me is those video things. They're great.
We have a question from Katrina, who's asked, if you have a person very close to you who doesn't want a funeral, what suggestions do you have to help a family to memorialize? I hope I put the accent on the right words.
I do have a family. I have 2 family members who don't want funerals, actually. So we've talked about that, and we've asked if it's okay to have a party. They just do not want anything formal, and they do not want both have donated their bodies to science. It's my sister and my stepfather, and both have donated their bodies. So they don't want a funeral. But we've said, can we gather? Can we? You know, there's a bit of Irish in my family, so the notion of the wake is a really it's sort of built into the DNA, that you gather and you tell stories. I mean, one of the things in my book actually is of someone getting up and telling a joke at Peter's funeral, this kind of long shaggy dog story. And I think that the value of humour is really important in that immediate, maybe not just the very first moment, but pretty soon afterwards. We need humour so badly. We need to be able to go, you know, to laugh, because laugh is release. And for someone like me who holds tears in and is quite private about that stuff and does it alone, laughter is at least an explosion outward, which is what tears want to be, you know. So yeah.
Thank you. Shell has asked and said, amazing talk. My question for Ailsa would be, for those that want to write about the lived experience of others, to give a voice to those whose stories may not have been heard prior to passing. And she says she works in the DV, the domestic violence advocacy space. What would you recommend they look at when approaching their writing?
So are you writing about them, or Shell, or have they left anything? Like, is it using their words, or using, you know, you're writing about them?
She said memorializing the victims in a way that give power to their life and story and make changes to law and people's hearts.
That's difficult, isn't it? Because I imagine, you know, the timing of that would be a big thing too, in terms of family and how they come to terms with it. But I suppose I would start with, if it were me, and it's an off the top of the head idea, I would start with collecting memories again, but I would start only with the memories that were, I don't mean the happy memories, I mean the memories of where the person had agency in their life. You know, there are moments for all of us where you think about someone and you think, like, if I were to do that, let's say about my Peter, actually what I would do is I would talk about him in a rehearsal room. That's where he was freest. That's where he was strongest. So I suppose, you know, I don't want to play down the terrible parts of these stories, but it seems to me that if you want to offer people a chance to memorialize them, then agency is something that gets taken away from people in those situations such a lot, that I would want to, partly to do with who I am, gather stories. And that would be my first question. Where did you witness that person? It might have been when they were swimming. It might have been when they were, you know, doing housework. I mean, it might have been a corner of a house that they were able to make theirs, or a corner of the world. But yeah, I think the thing, of course, is not to romanticize. And that's the challenge in a situation like that, because fear can make us do that. I think fear can make us go, tell us when the person was happy. It may not just be about happy. It's where they felt able in the world, perhaps. Also, I'll just say there's other forms too. I mean, of course, there's writing, but one of the things I love, it's just a little thing. Sometimes when I go walking in Centennial Park, there's a place that I mean, they call them stumbling stones, I think, but they're like little tiles or bricks that people can buy. And they're just one word or one sentence, and they'll sum up a person so beautifully, and then they'll have the name and maybe the dates. And I love the idea that there are these places where you just go, oh, Ailsa, friendship mattered to her more than anything. And you just think, oh, wow. And sometimes one sentence can be so potent, and it doesn't have to be a gravestone. It can be something else, those chairs, the backs of theatres. But also, I love it that in this park, there's just some bricks. And it might just be the one sentence that makes a person go, oh, wow, that might be all we need, says she, the most verbose person on the planet.
I love that, because you just made me think of what would I create to memorialize my mum. And my mum always used this ridiculous colonial Eurasian phrase when describing a good meal, which was, we had everything from soup to nuts. And that idea of, and she used it even right towards the end, from soup to nuts. And I love it because it's quite outdated now.
But it's beautiful. If I saw that, I would think, oh, wow, that's a life that's full.
Yeah. Barbara's also made an interesting point about the focusing on agency, which you mentioned, being quite brilliant, because it applies to remembering those who are slowly being lost to dementia or other illnesses. And I know this is something that touches so many of us. How do we, and do we choose, for example, to memorialize a friend before they get too far down the track of dementia? But it's actually it's so widespread. We all know people affected in this way.
No, I think that's really true. I have a friend who's in the very, very early stages, not even yet dementia. It's
Cognitive decline.
But she's very clear about what she wants for her sort of memorial and everything, which I think is wonderful. But I feel like it's the thing again of holding the essence of the person. It seems to me that that's the thing, and whether that be about recording their voice. I mean, I do think there's something, and people have different feelings about this, but I know I find it quite hard to listen to Peter's voice. It's almost too much, and it's been a long time. But I still think I'm glad I've got the voice recordings. And I do think there's something about, when someone is going into that world of forgetting or losing, that the voice is such a deeply, deeply immediate point of access, that if we can get recordings of them telling some of their story, it's not just the story before it's lost, it's actually the voice holds the person before they're lost. Because as we get older, our voice changes anyway, but I've noticed that with dementia, a lot of the people I've been around who've had it, their voices sort of get more frail and fearful because they are fearful. So I think voice is an underused form of memorializing. I think it's even just a clip of a minute of someone talking is profound, because it's like, it's like the way someone walks. You know how particular a walk is. In fact, voice prints, I know from the work I do, that now we have fingerprints to recognize people and face recognition, but actually a voice print is what a lot of agencies are using as recognition now when you ring into something. So if you think about how really personal a voice is, to record that, even just someone saying, "Hello, darling, it's lovely to see you," is really, I don't know, for me, it's very moving and important.
Amazing. I think that's actually, I don't know if there are any other questions. I'm going to rabbit on for a minute just to see if we do get any other questions. But also, I imagine, Ailsa, that you've done your audiobook yourself. So it would be a beauteous thing to have you reading your book to us. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Well, it was a funny thing recording that, actually, because I do other people's books, not very many. I don't do a lot of them. I mostly do the ones that I'll learn from. But yes, you do your own when you're a memoirist. And this one was I think, because that's the other thing I would say if you're writing about someone who's died, give yourself the space you need before you start to write. I don't think there's much value for me. Different people, Joan Didion, different, maybe